Hello everyone, so moving on to video number 2 now, so I'm carrying on discussing the it's a hard word to say, heterogeneity of autism and the neurodiversity paradigm and why, the very variability of autism, its heterogeneous nature is problematic when it comes to a wholesale application of the neurodiversity paradigm. So response 2 in regard to the neurodiversity paradigm is the presence of coexisting conditions. Now I touched upon this earlier, so we'll go into a bit more detail here. Now, many neurodiversity advocates argue that the harmful aspects of autism are not part of autism. So, for example, conditions such as epilepsy, which thankfully I don't have, but epilepsy is quite common among autistics. Thankfully I don't have that one. Mainly among those who are non-verbal, but there's a higher preponderance of epilepsy throughout the autism. This would allow conditions such as epilepsy to be cured since they are not, after all, part of the autism. Epilepsy is quite an extreme case, and I think most of us can agree that epilepsy is not part of autism. It appears quite it's not part of autism in a sense that it is quite clearly something that not all autistic people have, and yet it is a lot more common in autism, and we have to ask those questions, well, why is it more common in autism? And maybe again there are particular subtypes of autism where there's a kind of synergy going on. But there are other conditions that are actually more intrinsic to autism than epilepsy. So epilepsy is more common in autism, but it's clearly not intrinsic. But there are conditions which are harmful and that are obviously and clearly more intrinsic to autism, and this includes such things as impaired attention. Regardless of whether or not the person fulfills the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, impaired attention is indeed seen as quite intrinsic to autism. Most autistic people, to a greater or lesser degree, struggle with attention. I know I do. This means that it can be quite hard to stay focused in conversations around things you're not interested in. Attention can wander more easily, it's more fickle, it can be harder to focus, apart from when you're in states of hyperfocus, that is. That's very common in autism. Sensory is obviously intrinsic to autism. So you can't so easily divorce these aspects from autism as you can say with epilepsy. Yeah, and as for example, so while impaired attention is often associated with ADHD, difficulties with allocation of attention can also be a feature of autism when other diagnostic criteria of ADHD are absent. So even in the absence of other criteria of ADHD, difficulties with the allocation of attention seems to be kind of a very intrinsic autism feature, even though it is not actually a core symptom. So something could be an intrinsic feature of autism without it actually being required for diagnosis. So problems with attention is not a requirement for diagnosis. So in theory, someone can have autism and their attention can be absolutely fine. It's not an actual requirement for diagnosis. And yet, that doesn't mean it's not intrinsic to autism, because it's one of these symptoms that vast majority of autistic people do experience. So it's not essential, but it can still be intrinsic. I guess you could say it's not essential, but because it is so common in autism, it can still be an intrinsic feature for those who have a particular subtype where that is an issue, which seems to be the majority of autistic people. Now this is associated with executive dysfunction and monotropism, which is basically a fancy way of saying tunnel vision. 2 of the psychological mechanisms postulated as causes of autistic behaviours. And low mood or anxiety may be directly related to the distress arising from core autistic traits and the effects of narrow attention and sensory overload. Exactly it. I think with particular emphasis there on narrow attention. If you've got a brain that has a tendency to fixate, that fixation in some areas might not cause distress, but that same tendency to fixate may well make some autistic people more vulnerable to developing obsessive compulsive disorder. So obsessive compulsive disorder is not a core feature of autism. It might not be as common as difficulties with attention, and yet I would argue that for those autistic people who do have a vulnerability to OCD wherein it is clearly neurodevelopmental, i.e. early onset, I would say that is actually an intrinsic part of their whole disorder for them. I definitely think it is part of my intrinsic disorder for me. So saying, oh, that's a comorbid, that's not part of autism, is rather disingenuous, I think, for those people. Because just because not all autistic people have OCD and just because it's not part of a criteria for autism doesn't mean it can't be an intrinsic feature of that person's essentially disordered neurology. Yeah, and of course being autistic makes life more stressful, and again stress is a known vulnerability factor for the development of anxiety disorders. No matter what society you live in, being autistic is going to be more stressful. So there is this argument that what we call autism is actually the co-occurrence of separate behavioural features, each with its own causal mechanism. So this is a quote from Waterhouse. The expression of autism nearly always occurs with one or more additional non-diagnostic symptoms. So the decision as to which of a range of characteristics are and are not included in autism is arbitrary. It's arbitrary. So autism, like I say, in that respect, is obviously a construct. That doesn't mean it's not real, by the way, it is real. I'm just saying that in terms of what we include as part of autism and what we don't include is a decision taken by human actors that may not represent what is actually going on in the person's brain. Okay, that's very important. So this does not provide an objective reason for excluding harmful characteristics from autism itself. And I completely agree. When we can see how pure autism hardly ever happens, that's to say the very pure, narrow criteria for autism itself, hardly ever happens, and for those in whom they do just have those symptoms, i.e. nothing else, they usually are very able, because they don't have executive dysfunction, they don't have anything, they can compensate for any of the challenges that the narrow aspects of autism have, and often they find that they can use those the autistic traits sometimes more helpfully and compensate for the negative aspects precisely because they don't have additional challenges. But that is actually very rare. Unfortunately, though, it's those types of people that tend to be the loudest when it comes to the neurodiversity paradigm. So though it's rare, they speak the loudest. I would say they probably more have what I would describe as an autistic personality, as in traits. And then, of course, we get to the autism as identity cookie. I think I will have to come back to that another time, the autism as identity thing. But in a nutshell, that defends the assertion that autism is not intrinsically harmful as opposed to person first, because if autism is part of your identity, then clearly the person kind of sees the autism as harmless, it's just part of them. Whereas disorder is a separable fact, but I'll come back to that next time, so thank you for watching.